Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're just going to wait a few moments to allow others to join, and then we'll get started very shortly. While you're waiting, it'd be great to hear where you're joining from today. So please use the chat box. You're all familiar with this by now, but it'd be great to get a sense of kind of how broad. So we've got USA, London. Great, London, not too far from me. USA is a bit further away. Where else are you joining us from today? Leeds, yeah, very exotic. Leeds, Arizona, Lancashire, Cork, yay. Toronto, Maryland, St. Petersburg, Florida, nice. Atlanta, Ohio, Philly. Got a good North American to Guatemala. Oh, there we go. Tick. I've not had someone from Guatemala on a call before. That's fantastic. Few from Canada, Regina, Montreal, Virginia. Howdy from Houston. Yeah, howdy. Hi. Calgary. Great. So as more people join us, we're just going to take a moment, keep sharing where you're joining from. It's always nice to know. Amsterdam. Great. We've got some continental European friends as well. Monterrey, Mexico. Nice. Las Vegas. The Twin Cities. Welcome. We've got Chelmsford, Rome as well. Lorena in Rome. Cape Town. One of my favorite places. 2 people in Cape Town. Fantastic. Great to have you with us. Atlanta, Gulfport. Great, we've got a nice spread. So we've got some, a lot of colleagues from across North America. We've got some in Central and South America. Excuse me. We've got some from UK. We've got some from Europe. I can see we're ticking up just over 100. I'm going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. What else? Toronto, Columbus, Nashville. Fantastic. Helsinki. Great. Great to have you joining us from Finland. Welcome. Genève, welcome. Calgary, Philly, Basel, great. Great to have a good spread. Someone else, Isabel from Montreal, good to have you here. Thanks for sharing where you're joining from. Another colleague, Randy from Houston. Great. Someone else from South Africa and Southern California. Mighty Sheffield. I daren't ask whether you're a Blades or a Wednesday fan. That might be a bit divisive. That's one for the UK folks will understand that. Australia, wow, fantastic. We're almost circumnavigating the globe with your locations. This is terrific. St. John, great to have you here too. France, Montreal, Hong Kong, Spain, Tampa. They're now starting to go at a pace. So I can see we're up to 300 attendees. So I'm going to get us started for real. Please do keep sharing for everyone else who's on the call. A very warm welcome. My name is Joss Matheson, and I'm the Chief Encouragement Officer at Change Oasis. We're a specialist change, communications, and culture consultancy. I'm also a former communications director for companies like Barclays and GSK. But now I coach leaders, teams, and organizations to change their story and change the world. So I'm going to be your host today about making communications a strategic function for your executive team. And I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion because I'm joined by the one and only David Hart. David, thank you for being here. Please say hi and tell everyone a bit more about you.
Thanks, Joss, and hi, everyone. It's great to see people from all around the world joining. I think this is a topic that transcends the globe. And us in communications, I think, something that's close to all of our hearts. So my name's David Hart. I've been in communications for 20 years, both in UK politics, which is interesting today if people are watching the news, in agency at Fleischmann Hillard and Burson Marsteller, and the last 10 years working in corporates for both SABMiller and then Coca-Cola HBC. I've set up a freelance business, which I was saying to Joss before, I was hoping would bring a better work-life balance, but actually I think you find when you work for yourself that it becomes busier than ever before. So really looking forward to today. Over those 20 years, I've seen communications change massively from how, where, what we talk about, where we talk about it, how we talk about it. But I've never lost my passion and belief in the power of comms and the power of storytelling to bring about change. So really looking forward to an engaging session.
Fantastic. I know you're going to have loads of insights and also ideas to share with our audience today. And for those of you joining us in our audience, please do submit your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and we'll try and answer those either as we go through or leave a little bit of time at the end. So if you've got a question as opposed to a comment, please do put it in the Q&A box. And for those of you, I'm not sure there will be anyone, this is the first time on Zoom. If you go down towards the bottom of the screen and hover your cursor, you'll see Q&A. So please do submit your questions that way. So as I said, we're going to be discussing how to demonstrate the strategic value of communications to your CEO and executive team. Now, I think, David, we should start by just exploring what do we mean by strategic and why is this important? It's a word we hear a lot, but what does it mean for you?
Well, for me, it means having a seat at the top table, essentially, because I think we in communications have allowed the value of what we do to be disconnected with the understanding of other people's value of what we do. And I think where we change from other functions, so you think of HR, commercial, legal, finance, etc., they sit at the top table and have those discussions about the strategic shift of the business. And we don't often have those conversations. Now, I'm delighted to see many peers who do sit at that table, and I think that is changing, but I don't think we'll be seen as a strategic function, a strategic imperative to the business until many more of them are having those discussions. And I think the reason why we're strategic is we bring a unique perspective to the discussion. So we bring the perspective of the outside in, but we also bring the perspective of what employees are saying and thinking and doing about the direction of the business. And without that perspective and without that addition to the discussion, I think it's a lesser of a discussion. So the more we're involved in the top table, the more we're seen as a strategic function, the better it will be. And I would just say, I mean, some people have described the current times as a polycrisis. I mean, if you look anywhere in the news, you see crisis, whether it's the climate crisis, whether you see, war on the continent of Europe again, whether you see the challenges that brings in terms of inflation and interest rates, costs and supply chain and raw materials. If we can't shine in this time, when are we going to shine? And you add to that, that we're having challenges with retention and people are becoming much more discerning about the values and the purpose of the business they want to work for. So, this is the time for us to connect the two and talk about the strategic nature of comms and why comms is a strategic imperative for every business.
Yeah, well said. I totally agree. And I see this a lot with clients, and I've struggled with this through my career as well. I think one of the challenges, as you say, the world's speeding up, the demands on us actually getting greater as people appreciate the value that communications can bring. And with that brings the challenge that actually strategy is really about choices, isn't it? It's about saying, well, if we say yes to this, what are we going to say no to? We have to decide actually where are the priorities. I think you framed it well. In the world we're in, where can we add the greatest value to the companies that we're part of? Let me just ask you about that choices point, David. I mean, that strikes me as a challenge, particularly if you've got a team which, in a lot of organizations is not that big. I mean, how big was your team at Coca-Cola HBC as an example?
So it was a team of 6 people, bearing in mind it was an organization of 33,000 across 29 markets. So a relatively small team having to cover not just internal comms, but also external comms and social. So it required us to do an awful lot of stuff and make an awful lot of decisions. And I think where sometimes communications as a function gets it wrong is this power and ability to say no. And within every organization, everybody has their own pet project. Everybody has their own thing they want to communicate. And I think we as communicators have to get much better at saying, look, how does this fit into the strategy of the business? Not that we're necessarily not going to communicate it, but we want to communicate it in a way that fits with the strategy. And I think that's one of the challenges, one of the things we've been getting wrong and we need to change.
Okay, so much more than around, I guess, both understanding and aligning with the key business drivers for your organization.
Yeah, I think if I look at the challenge we have, I think people look to communications and they wonder whether we have a real understanding of the business. I think if you compare to commercial or you compare to some of the other parts of the organization that have very obvious KPIs linked to the business, they look at communicators and they think, do you really get it? And we've enabled that a little bit because we've pushed ourselves down a route where we're not being necessarily strategic and we are being very transactional. We're sending out a message and we're not creating a conversation. So I think we need to get a little bit better at that to try and form this understanding of where we are. And what that's also doing, this inability to say no, is it's adding to the noise. I see various pulse surveys from across different businesses, and people generally are saying they're overworked, work-life balance isn't connecting in the right way. And there we are as comms or as HR and comms saying, hey, join this seminar, read this blog, listen to this podcast, watch this video. And they're thinking, I don't have time to do this. And what's happening actually is we're pushing those people into closed groups, into their WhatsApp groups, their closed Teams groups, or into external comms, looking at LinkedIn instead of using the corporate channels. So that's not good for us, because we want those corporate channels to be engaging and engaged with. And it's not good necessarily for the business, because they're not engaged in the kind of conversation we want them to be involved in.
Yeah, I think you're going to a really interesting area here. So I heard you say, perhaps one of the things we've been getting wrong. It'd be good to explore that a little bit more, because I guess inherent in the topic we've chosen for this session is a bit of a challenge to us as communicators, that are we being strategic enough? So building on those points that you've made, where else would you say there's an opportunity for us to up our game? What else could we be doing?
I mean, I see a huge amount of fantastic internal communications, and I've judged awards around this, and I see some brilliant stuff. So I wouldn't generate anyway the power and the abilities of the internal comms world to do stuff well. I think sometimes we just frame it in the wrong way. So there's this whole point about connecting to strategy, and I can say a few practical ways that I've done that in the past in a moment. I also think there's this challenge around measurement and producing the right measurement. I still see too many teams talking about output rather than outcomes. Too many teams saying in their KPIs that they'll do 10 newsletters a year, or they'll do 15 podcasts. Let's really try and connect the value that they bring, or the value of convening the entire organization on a town hall, rather than just saying we've done it or we're going to do it. The point about being transactional is important on two fronts, because on one point we're putting news out there, but at the same time we're saying things in the wrong way to our senior leadership. So I often hear conversations like to a CEO or senior leader, I need you to record a video, I need you to write a blog post, I need you to appear on the podcast. That's not what they want to hear in their busy days. They want to know why that's strategic. And one of the simplest shifts that I made was doing that. So instead of saying to the CEO, I need 20 minutes of your time to record a video, I would say, I need 20 minutes of your time to record a video on this strategic imperative to the business that's going to really help with X, Y, and Z. And then you get a very different reaction. So I think in some ways we've been our own worst enemy in shifting ourselves away from being seen to be strategic. But it's really simple to change, and I think we can do it relatively quickly.
Yeah, so it really struck me. Simon Sinek would be applauding you, because you said why. We should start with why. I think that's right. Why are we doing any activity? I also heard you talk about outcomes, not outputs. That used to be my mantra with my teams in the past. Absolutely. Business doesn't really care whether we do a video. The business cares whether we help the business to perform. Exactly. And that's what we've got to bring as a lens. There's a related question here, which Casey's asked, and maybe I can bring this in, because I think you're starting to go into this. So what guidance do you have for comms people who report into a manager that doesn't truly see the point or value of strategic comms? Ever experienced that yourself, Dave? Have you ever been in that position?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment, but yes, of course, because we all have. And it is a big challenge, right? It's not just a specific line manager, it's also sometimes whole executive teams. And I think what we need to do is really think about how we can drive this idea of measurement. So A, shifting away from outcomes, but B, looking at how we connect our KPIs, our value to the value of the business. And a really great example of this is health and safety campaigns, right? We drive health and safety campaigns to reduce accidents and to prevent sometimes deaths. Now, this is a really powerful thing that we do. And if you get that communications right, we're actually saving lives. So if we talk about the way and the way we do things and the things that we do in that form of words, I think that really helps to persuade. But it is a challenge, and the way that I've done it in the past is through a very English phrase, the proof of the pudding, right? So showing that communications works because it engages people and because more people are understanding and motivated by the strategy. showing that communications work because more people are engaged in the sessions, asking questions, getting involved in the discussions and the town halls. And actually a very simple measure is that more people are engaged in external places. So they're happy to talk proactively and positively about the business on their own social media channels. So I think it's about how we frame it. And I think if you can show that line manager or that executive team what we can do with communications and the power of communications to shift people's minds, to build communities and to create ecosystems of communities around the business and the business priorities, that will really help with that persuasive argument.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems we struck a chord. I'm just noticing Danny's comment in the chat said, I once had a head asked me, in all seriousness, when do you think we'll be finished with comms? Which I suspect many on the call can relate to. So there's an educational component here, not just for ourselves, but for our stakeholders. We need to actually help them understand what we can do to help them. So as you say, the way we talk about ourselves, the way we present ourselves, the way we demonstrate the impact, but, when taken away, it's kind of where we're focusing. We really need to get better at actually making those choices around where we focus. I'd like to bring in another question for our audience, which I think would be interesting to explore. And apologies, it says guest, so I don't know who this is from. But back to the size of the team that you had in your last role, David. Yeah. Did you have embedded communications people at the regional or country level? Be interesting to hear about that, but also, how did that then shape the way that you went about the role? How did you structure your team in order to be more strategic? Maybe you can say a bit about that and help people to understand that.
Yeah, and in both SABMiller and Coca-Cola HBC, we had a very, very small central team, but we had people on the ground in the market. So in each of those businesses, we had between 50 and 60 people on the ground. And actually that is brilliant for communications, because the dream of communications is you have a central narrative that people stick to with local flavor and local language. Yes, it's really powerful being able to do things in different languages. I think what we need to be able to do is make sure that we stick to a central narrative, and that's what the group team was doing in a way, was driving that narrative and that strategy, and the guys on the ground were implementing it for us.
And so tell us a little bit more, Dave. What was the relationship then? How good was that? Because in some organizations, typically when you get a larger organization, you often get a matrix, or you get a slight tension between local colleagues and the central group. How did you build that connection and relationship between the two?
Well, as you would expect me to say, the power of communication. So but you're totally right that the leadership team on the ground, the communications team, were reporting into the GM of the team, right? So they had this sort of dotted line, strange relationship with the group, but they had to make sure that their boss was happy and they were delivering the right messages to the right people on the right channels in each of our markets. So there is a challenge, and there is sometimes a tension between group and country. What I always found was to appear and always try to help. And many times we would share best practice between the teams, and that's where communication comes in. So a regular monthly call to make sure that it wasn't the group team telling the markets what to do. We could frame the strategy and the conversation, but it was the country teams telling other country teams what worked really well, or what didn't land so well, or what really got much engagement in terms of social media or internally. So I think it's about facilitating a conversation. It's about facilitating a learning from best practice. But it's also about guiding. And then when it comes to things like crisis, obviously that's when the value of the group team really comes to the fore. And even if there is sometimes some tension between market and group in these scenarios, everyone seems to sing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a consistency thing, a coordination thing sometimes as well, isn't it? How do we allow the local colleagues to actually do what they need to do in the market? Because they know that best. They're closer to the customer in that market, they're closer to their supplier partners and others. But actually, we want it to feel like, yeah, we're all wearing the same T-shirt. We're all part of the same organization, on message, on brand, and as you say, when there's a crisis, that's when you really test actually if those connections and relationships, are they working in the right way? And that's interesting. I'm seeing a number of comments coming in the chat, also seeing more questions coming in. So David, I'm going to go a little bit off the kind of frame and script that we talked about and take some of these questions, if that's okay with you, because I think it's a good one. So someone's put a question here, which I think is a really good one, which links to some of what you were saying earlier around, how do we measure the impact? So what would you recommend for comms teams as targets that are measurable and also add value to the bottom line? Can you come back and say a little bit more about that?
Yes, so I mean, what I've done successfully with this in the past is use some of the elements that are already available, things like pulse surveys or ad hoc pulse surveys, to test things like understanding of strategy, things like whether the leadership are communicating effectively or in a timely manner or transparently. And I think those kind of real-time measuring tools are really good. Now, alongside being able to measure, who engages with the content that you're putting out and who responds and has a conversation with that content, adds to that, I think. Now, having said that, I still think we, as a communication function, have struggled to find, the silver bullet here. And when I look at external comms, we have some much stronger tools in terms of pointing to the value of communications, even down to driving sales, protecting reputation, or shifting reputation over time. Internally, it's a lot more challenging, and it does come down, I think, to surveys still, which people get very challenged by because they add to the noise. But I think they bring, because they're anonymous generally, they bring the most real answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't disagree. There's a few other related questions around measurement. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask a couple of others while we're on this. So Katka has asked, what KPIs are essential, and how can you show your executive what you achieved? Now that's quite an interesting question. I guess there's a lot of different ways to answer that in terms of what KPIs are essential. But maybe you can give a flavour. What were some of the things that you measured in previous roles?
So we measured understanding of strategy. We measured engagement. We measured motivation. Would you recommend the business or your role to a friend? And I think those are the things that we can talk about. Actual KPIs. We actually had to move away from some of those output KPIs when I joined some of these organizations, because we had things still like numbers of town halls, we had things like numbers of newsletters, etc. And the simplest shift we did was the attendance at those. So we could look over time at who attended, who engaged, the number of questions, those that responded to the blog or whatever we put up on the back of that. And I think they're the only kind of real KPIs that we can use, because internally it's a bit more challenging, as I said, than externally. But if other people have different views on that, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, well, maybe that's an opportunity to be able to put their views in the chat. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? I've always thought that we need to get close to what the business is measuring first, and then understand how we can influence that. So having spent a few years leading communications in supply chain in the past, and we had weekly stand-up meetings reviewing the KPIs for the business, and anything that my communications team did was orientated around what are we doing. So you mentioned safety earlier. It might be quality, might be defects, might be other things, but actually it was tuning into what's happening in the business, so really being on that. Linking to that, I've had another question, which is I would love more insight on reaching employees who don't sit in front of a computer or even access their email. And you mentioned it earlier, often colleagues who work in factories, they'll often be offline colleagues as opposed to online. So email isn't the solution. So what have you done? Because you must have had that in previous organizations as manufacturing organizations. Were there particularly good ways of getting around that problem?
Yeah, one of the best things we did was a bring your own device policy, which I think works really well. Now, it works based on trust, because it's an app that you have on your own mobile phone, and you require the end user to understand that the company can't engage with any of the other content on their phone. So it takes a big communication effort to build that trust, and it did take some time to get people across the board to pick up on this as a thing. But the good thing about it was not only could they see communications, but they could engage with compulsory trainings, for example. So that was one thing. The other thing we did was massively increase terminals in plants, for example, so that people in their breaks could engage on email using those terminals. There's no panacea on this, I don't think. I mean, I think there's a real challenge around how you communicate with those people. And the favorite and the best thing still to do is the stand-up meeting with the plant manager or the team leader on the day.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's understanding how does communication flow in different environments within your overall ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the communication flow within a factory is very different to within office where people are connected, but we still shouldn't overlook that person-to-person communication. It's really important. It should be a key part of our strategy. Maybe kind of, going to the other end of the scale, is a question around how do you host the equivalent of a town hall at a global level rather than at a site or country level? And they're thinking specifically about language barriers and hosting a Q&A with that many people. Now, again, you've worked in international businesses, so it's probably no magic wand, but how did you tackle that problem?
There's not a magic wand. I mean, every business that I've worked in has had an international language, which has been English. However, there are some brilliant tools now that do real-time translation. And we started just before I left my last role. We were starting to look at those about how we could do real-time translation. It's not ideal, and it chucks up some pretty funny words occasionally and slightly out of context things, but at least it gives some sense of where we're going. The other thing that we did, which is sometimes the thing that creates some challenge between the group and the country teams, is we asked them to add subtitles or translate the transcripts afterwards and share those. Now that creates a lot of expense and a lot of resource, and sometimes a bit of annoyance from the teams because they need to understand the value of doing that. But that's probably the only thing that we could do apart from the real-time translation.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. There's a question here which I'm trying to fit in as many questions as we can, because I think that's where some of the value is responding to what people want to know. What advice would you have, David, where it's a smaller company, maybe it's 50 employees, and so there may not be a dedicated comms person. There might be one person. There's been some messages in the chat around when you're a team of one, that's pretty tough. I mean, you had a relatively small team, but then you had colleagues in the markets too. So what would you say to someone who's trying to improve communications in a smaller company? Might not be a formal role, or it might be one person. Again, back to this topic of being strategic. What guidance would you offer?
So I think it's about fighting the right battles, right? So I think it's about making sure that you can align your strategy on a communication side with the strategy of the business, and making sure that you have some very quick wins in terms of doing that communication. Actually, when I started in my last role, I was 1.5 an FTE, and I found that actually connecting the strategy to the business, and I did it in a very practical way, actually, of assigning communication managers to the strategic pillars of the business. So we had a communication manager for customer centricity, for sustainability and people and performance, so that it was obvious that everything we did fitted into one of those strategic pillars. And I find that gave me actually license to grow the team. And so I think it's in a bigger organization, it's about how you connect with that strategy and therefore enable yourself to build the team and strengthen the team. In a smaller company, I think it's about being smart with the tools that you use, being smart with the channels that you use, and quick wins to show the value of comms and how it's bringing even a small team of 50 together.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a couple of questions around kind of internal politics and relationships, which are I'm going to give you a flavour of kind of what we got. So we had one question is, if you could build a C-suite for a company, would you have a chief communications officer similar to CFO, CHRO, etc.? In my organisation, internal comms rolls up through our CHRO and external comms reports up through our chief legal officer. I'll pause on the other questions. What's your view on that, David?
It's a very simple answer, which is yes. I think, I said at the start, more organizations are getting chief comms officers. I don't think we can be greedy and have a chief internal comms and external, but I think we should be having chief comms officers on leadership teams, because there is this perspective requirement, because we are a strategic function in the same way that HR, in the same way that legal, finance, commercial is. And we add a huge value in terms of perspective and bringing outside thinking in. So I think it's a must, particularly in the times that we live in, that we are part of those discussions and bring that perspective to the challenges or opportunities when it comes to reputation, to the short, mid and long-term decision making of the business.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, whether you work in internal communications, external communications. What is it you know or can know which your leaders don't? And by bringing that to their attention, how does that influence their thinking? How does it shape their decisions? So I think, we have to be better at picking up what our audiences think and feel and using that. So back to measurement and impact, I think there's a real opportunity. A follow-up question for you. How do you navigate leadership politics and especially conflicting agendas?
Yeah, and it's one of my big learnings actually from 10 years in working in corporate, is how you navigate the corporates. And in some of those corporates, there's been people on the senior leadership team who don't have time for communication, and some there's others that are really driven by it and think it's a fantastic thing. Again, I think it's about showing the power of communication and the good that you can drive and engagement you can create with communication, whether that's internally with your best advocates, your people, or externally with the communities that you want to build around your message. But ultimately, I also found that you can use communication to change people's minds. And a simple example of that is if you look at a team, for example, big data and advanced analytics, to give an example. They don't see much of the limelight generally. They do a lot of stuff behind the scenes. They do fantastic stuff. But you give them the opportunity to talk about that work publicly within the business, or sometimes outside the business through our external channels, and you're bringing real value to the work that they do. So, or you're at least giving visibility to the value of the work that they do. So I think it's about using opportunities to bring people into the fold and show them the power of communication, because done right, communication can really motivate organizations. It can drive retention. It can help organizations to move forward in a much smoother way with people united around their strategy. But sometimes we don't have those conversations. And I think it's about, going back to this point about influence and persuasion and having those sometimes difficult conversations with people.
That's interesting. There's a couple of related questions that I think build on that. So somebody's asked, you referenced at the start various departments and areas all having their own objectives, in a sense, competing for employees' attention, and communicators' role in prioritizing based on strategy. How do you create buy-in and prevent departments from competing with each other or going rogue and just pushing out whatever they want to say on their own directly? So I guess that's the least sexy word in communications. It's governance, really. How do you do that?
Yeah, and there's an addition to that, which I've seen, not in the organizations I've worked in, but in some other organizations, whereby those functions just create their own comms officer or their own comms manager because they don't feel they're getting the service from the group team. So there is a danger in that. But I think it's about thinking. So when you say no to somebody, it's about saying no in the right way. So it's saying, look, what your project is fantastic. We'd love to communicate it, but how does it link to pillar 1, 2, or 3 of the strategy? And that actually gets them to think a bit more about the story that they've got and why it's important. Now, most of the time, in fact, 90% of the time, that story will be important, because otherwise they wouldn't have been tasked to do it. But it's how you link it back to the overall strategy. So it's saying no, but I think, as somebody said earlier, to make people really think about why the thing they want to talk about sits strategically with the company message. And this really helps with this noise issue. And I think it is a real problem that we, in the past, on too many occasions, comms functions have just said yes to everything. We've just pumped out different stories day after day, sometimes several a day. And that really doesn't help us, because people switch off from those emails. Like I said earlier, they switch to closed groups on WhatsApp or on Teams. and they really turn away from the company content. And that's the worst of the worlds for us, because we want people to be connected with that.
Yeah, okay. So we don't just have internal communicators, join us today. We've got a question here which is about media opportunities. So what's the best strategy for bringing media opportunities to media adverse executives? I think we could extrapolate that to say, how do we get leaders to engage more with their people on the inside as much as being prepared to talk to the media? But your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenge. I think there is a big shift in the role of the CEO that we've seen in the last 10 years, from being a leader of the business to being a leader of the business plus a facilitator of conversation. And if you look at some examples of CEOs online, like Mary Barra at General Motors, they're required to proactively and publicly stand by their strategy and promote their strategy by starting conversations, sometimes on difficult topics. And I think that the best way to show CEOs or senior leaders how this works is to show some of these examples, because at the end of the day, what you have is a CEO creating a discussion, facilitating a conversation, which will often lead to some challenge, but it will generally lead to people understanding a bit more about the business. And that comes not just from social media and own channels, but media as well. I've always been a huge advocate of engaging with media, but also engaging with social. And I did a LinkedIn post a few weeks ago about unleashing the advocates. And I think there are challenges with getting this across the line in terms of senior leaders, because the natural reaction is to be quite nervous about taking the internal external. But on every occasion I've seen it happen, it's brought brilliant results in terms of engagement internally, but also engagement and building communities and ecosystems of communities externally. As long as you've got the right policies in place, as long as you've got the right procedures in place, as long as you've got the right security in place and the right training, what I would advise is that you unleash those advocates and let them go for it. And when reluctant leaders see people in their organization getting great pickup in terms of engagement on social media, it tends to help with driving them to do the same.
Yeah, brilliant. I can't believe the time's gone so quickly. We're almost out of time. So I'm going to have to, kind of bring this to a close. We could go on talking, I'm sure, and answering questions for a lot longer, but this has been really rich. David, what would you say then in closing to wrap things up, in terms of this, idea of making communications a more strategic function in the eyes of the CEO and executive team? What would your 3 key takeaway messages be for people?
So firstly, that now is our time. If this isn't our time, I don't know what the time is. So it's the time to really think about how we connect with strategy and how we as a communications community talk up the power of communications as a strategic imperative for the business. That would be my number 1. Number 2 would be to unleash the advocates, really push for individuals in the organization to talk proactively and positively about the organization. Too many organizations I see have transparency as one of their values, and yet they hold their people back from talking about it. And the third one, I think, is to connect. Now, I think we as a community need to connect, to share best practice, share challenges, as many people have done in the chat today, and I really look forward to reading through it. So I'd love to carry on this conversation, and to do that, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm regularly updating on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with people on this group. I'd love to keep that conversation going so that we can share ideas, share best practice, and really help each other to drive the strategic nature of communications, and eventually to create opportunities for all of us to take those C-suite opportunities in the future.
Fantastic. And Molly's just shared, QR code link to connect with you on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. I mean, I know, David, we've done work together over, the years, and, you're a man after my own heart, and I can see the applause and heart emojis flooding in. So I think people have really appreciated you sharing your insights. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much for the questions. Thank you for putting your thoughts in the chat. If we didn't get to your question, sorry, but as we say, feel free to connect with David and I on LinkedIn. David, thank you again. It's been great to spend this time with you. And for those of you who've joined us, I hope you very much enjoy the rest of Engaged 23. Thanks very much for being here with us.
Thanks, everyone.